Good when I don't know.
And educated now.
Okay, folks, we are getting back started again. I think we're just gonna spend like another hour and then say farewell to us for the farewell to each other. That's what we do. Say farewell to each other.
Okay.
And
I can do whatever is asked of me.
wow.
Was that required?
Okay, so John, do you think you could share the document that we're working from? And
Yes.
Just like start from the top, actually?
Can I propose something slightly?
Absolutely.
I was going to suggest that I explain the excess spending concept without the language in front of you, and then I can do that.
Great.
Cool. So, John Gray, Office of Legislative Counsel. I think it may just be easier not to have a bunch of definitions in front of you. So just to set up the problem you're trying to solve with what we're currently in the draft calling excess spending, but what I'm understanding, there's a strong appetite to change those words. But as currently drafted, we're talking about excess spending, which is the locally voted amount above the educational opportunity payment. So the task that you're one of the problems that you're trying to solve here is how do you raise that amount and do it in an equitable manner? How do you do it such that folks in lower taxing capacity districts aren't required to use higher rates to raise the same funds that other districts would? So the administration's proposal had been to create this concept called the state guarantee, and it would be tied to the median taxing capacity district. And when I'm calling out taxing capacity, what I'm talking about is how much in equalized education property tax grand list do you have available per pupil? And in this case, we're talking about per long-term membership, but it's a pupil count. How much property wealth would you support for each student is basically what this is getting at. So in the administration's proposal, they tied it to the median school district. The state guarantee would kick school districts that are below the median up to that median school district. So the effect would be that anyone who is below the median district could tax at the same rate and receive the same funds as a school district that is that median wealth school district. But school districts that were wealthier than the median could tax at lower rates to raise the same funds. So it produced this sort of equity problem, which is what we have talked so much about when we talk about Brigham. One alternative to doing this is just to tax everyone as if they are the school district with the lowest taxing capacity. Everyone would have the same rates applied. They would raise different amounts, but they would receive the same amounts. And that's what this proposal is you're identifying the school district with the lowest taxing capacity, and you're asking what could they raise at a given rate? And then based on that rate, you say, well, I've approved this amount of spending, and I can compare that against what it would take to raise it in the school district with the lowest taxing capacity, and I'm going to apply the same rate as they would take to raise those funds. The end result is that you raise more because you're a school district that has more wealth than the school district with the lowest taxing capacity, but you don't get to keep those extra funds. That goes into the reserve, the excess spending reserve that's created in the ed fund. So that's
And then it's essentially returned to everyone.
Yep, exactly. So that is the basic concept, and that's what we're talking about when we talk about the excess spending yield.
Can I just
Yeah.
clarify? So I understand the rate of the lowest
Mhm.
district. That rate applied to the district with the lowest grand list raises X amount of dollars. District with a higher grand list would raise X plus Y, but they only get to keep X.
Exactly.
Y would go back into the pot.
Exactly. Everyone receives what they vote.
Yeah.
But for taxing purposes, they pretend that they are the school district with the lowest taxing capacity and apply the rate that would be required in that lowest taxing capacity school district.
And to be like maybe overly mechanical about it, my understanding of the language is that no district is saving the money or retaining the money. Everyone is
Exactly.
sending that revenue to the state and then having money be.
That's right. And that's another big, sorry.
Everyone or only those districts that have elected to spend more than the base?
So only districts that have elected to spend more than the base will be in this bucket to consider this, but anyone who votes extra funds,
Yeah.
all of that money goes up to the state, part of it's reserved, and then the voted amount comes back to the school districts that have voted those amounts.
And that's true under the foundation part, like under the I'm not sure if
The
I'm
governor's
entirely
on this?
I'm not sure I'm entirely understanding your question, but under the foundation formula, even if folks aren't spending, it's the money
Yes.
raised at the state
Statewide.
level and that's distributed.
Exactly. Exactly.
And I can understand that for the base, and
Okay.
under the governor's formula, it was all the funds that would go into the state guarantee are being raised by general taxes, and then those funds would be available without anybody voting on any extra money.
Well, so they would be available, but the state guarantee would only apply to folks who have voted an amount.
Yes, right, but they are not receiving those funds because another district that's decided to spend more.
Right.
Right. And in this case, yes, that they would, that's where the deficit is. If your school district is at that low amount,
Mhm.
and then you vote to actually spend more, and nobody else
What do you mean by
does,
that low amount?
from,
That's the
from
lowest.
The lowest tax.
the lowest taxing rate. So if you're in the lowest income or property wealth, the poorest school districts, if you measure it by property wealth, if you vote to spend more than the base amount that's from the funding formula, and nobody else does, right? So you need to get more money than what you're voting on.
No. So, no.
Get
no.
exactly what you voted on.
Yeah,
Exactly.
what you're voting on.
So this is a big distinction.
Okay, yes, thank you, got it.
So in each school district, the funds are raised locally, but you are taxed at a rate as if you were the lowest taxing capacity. But in each case, anyone who votes to approve above the educational opportunity payment is raising the entirety of the funds that they vote. And they're also raising extra. And the extra will vary. So we've talked about if you're the wealthiest district, you would raise more because you're taxing at the rate that would be the lowest taxing capacity district. But you would be raising more because your property base is higher, right? The piece we haven't talked about is the penalty, and I may wait for a second to explain that. Just because I think it will be simpler to walk through like a hypothetical of this particular concept of the excess spending yield. So one of the nice features of this proposal is that you just have a set of, you just have to carry out mathematical functions on received data, right? So we identify the school district with the lowest taxing capacity. We can just look at the aggregate equalized education property tax grand list. We can look at your membership, and from that we can identify who is that school district with the lowest taxing capacity. Then we can just ask the question, what can you raise at a given rate? So for simplicity, I'm going to leave out the penalty and I'll explain how the penalty works. Let's say you're the lowest taxing capacity district could at $1 per $100 of equalized property value raise $10,000. So you can raise $10,000 in that lowest taxing capacity district. If your district wants to raise $10,000, you take $10,000 and you divide it by the 10,000 that's required that would be raised in the lowest taxing capacity district, and that gives you 1. So that's your rate, 1%. You have the same percentage they do. At 1%, you raise $10,000. The place, and I can pause it.
I don't know if I gestured something towards you,
Oh, no.
but I didn't mean.
I thought you looked quizzical, and I wasn't sure if I should.
Really trying to get through the day, John. It's not.
Okay. The place where the penalty comes in is that you could imagine a different rate than that $1 rate. So $1 is easy for us to talk about. That's why we so commonly talk about it, and it's the base used for the homestead rate. But in the proposal that we have here, we're saying that the rate will be 0.8, so 80 cents on the dollar per 100. And this builds the penalty into the proposal. So let's say now you're asking, what could that lowest taxing capacity district raise at 0.8 or 80 cents on the dollar? They could raise 8,000 if we're still talking about the same 10,000 at $1, right? So they could raise 8,000. You still want to raise in your district $10,000. So you take 10,000 and you divide it by that 8,000, and it gives you a rate of 1.25. So now to raise the 10,000 that you wanted, you have to use a rate of 1.25% rather than 1%. So I'm going to pause there, but that's how the penalty is built in. It basically compares the funds you want to raise against what could be raised at 80 cents on the
Can I
dollar.
ask you a question?
Yes.
So I can't make it a question.
Yep.
Does everyone have basically the same tax rate but sometimes the state gets some extra money to redistribute, to put in a reserve. And sometimes the state doesn't.
In
that a way of-
in all cases, there would be something to go to the reserve because the penalty is built in for all districts. So the penalty, which is that results from using
But
the,
everyone has the same tax rate.
everyone has the same
Everyone has
tax
the same
rate.
tax rate regardless of where they live.
Exactly,
It's
exactly.
just that in some cases, more money goes into a reserve, and in some cases, less money goes.
That's exactly right. That's,
And then everyone in the whole state gets to use the reserve.
yes,
Okay,
that's right.
So why have a penalty?
It raises extra funds, but that's a policy question for the,
both it raises extra funds, and I think towards I think there's a longstanding sort of concern about equity in the system and an interest in maintaining equity in the system post Brigham. And that the foundation formula is supposed to be enough. We want to maintain pressure on the on our future selves here to fully fund the foundation formula. And if we make it too easy for folks to spend on top of the foundation formula, we're going to lose the pressure to fully fund the foundation formula. And for me, that's one of the lessons I've heard when we have sort of the national experts in to talk about this.
But the fact that we are asking towns or school districts to spend more money than they're actually going to get back is enough of a penalty by itself.
Yeah, yes, that is the penalty. Yes, it's just, that's the penalty.
Right.
Yes.
So
No,
why
but you're
do
kind of
we-
That
doubling
is
down on
the-
the penalty.
You're doubling down on the penalty, you're going to
Because-
the 80%.
Yeah, no, because well, because I guess I don't think it's fair for one district to not have a penalty when every single other district does,
Well,
right?
this is what I'm not getting. If we're all paying the same rate and at the rate that the lower, the
Mhm.
person least able to raise the taxes is able to completely raise what they need at $1, why would you make them pay $1.20? Not you, but why make the formula? I don't get what their penalty even is because they're at $1 and it raises the 10,000. Well, where's the penalty? And why would you-
penalty is by comparing against the 80 cents on the dollar. So for them to raise what they could raise at 1% absent a penalty, they have to raise at 1.25. Because you have the 1 divided by 8, that's effectively what's creating the penalty. But I'm not sure that that's,
So would folks want, before we go into all the language with John, do we want to shift to have Julia saying sort of the same thing in Julia words? Okay.
I think, because I thought I understood it. and now
I understood both of you and I thought, how can those both things be true at the same time?
I think we're all saying the same thing and all three things are true at the same time. Okay, John, we're gonna ask you to.
sure. I will
You can just
not be
move over.
insulted, but no.
You just
What you tried to describe is what's in the draft.
Exactly. That's the way to be.
And I think it's actually just that for complicated stuff, it's helpful for most people's brains to hear it in three different ways.
Well, I think.
It's,
I'll listen.
Okay. Yes, please, thank you. And I'm sorry to put you on the spot on this one.
No, not at, no apology necessary. I've been thinking about this a lot, so. I'm Julia Richter with Joint Fiscal Office. I don't have any written material, like slides or materials, but I'm happy to talk through it.
And we can look at some slides over next week.
And I can certainly prep some over the weekend if numbers or examples would be helpful. I just don't have them ready right now. Madam Chair, do you want me to just sort of talk? Okay. So I think it would be helpful to take a big step back and think about what we're talking about just in general, right? So the bill contemplates a foundation formula, which is saying, every school district gets X number of dollars. We're talking about raising those dollars on top of that foundation formula. And the big question is, how are those dollars raised? And how are they equalized across the state, those tax rates? And if so, how does that equalization mechanism work? So what the bill has here is essentially all of the math aside, which we can get into, essentially what it's saying is regardless of what school district you are in, if you decide to spend X number of dollars per pupil above the foundation amount, you get a certain tax rate. So regardless of how property wealthy the district is, you are guaranteed a certain amount per pupil for a certain tax rate. Full stop. That is the gist of the proposal. And the way that equalization mechanism works is essentially it says, okay, we're gonna have we have all of these districts, whatever they are, across the state that have different grand list values per pupil, right? You're gonna have some districts with a ton of property wealth per pupil, perhaps other districts with less. And if there was no equalization mechanism, then if, your property wealthy district wanted to raise a certain number of funds and your property poor district wanted to raise the same amount of funds, the property poor district would need a much higher rate to raise the same amount of funds.
I think where I'm getting stuck is regardless of what the rate is, the property rich district can raise a lot more at 1.25 than a property poor district. So that's where I'm getting that's what I'm not understanding.
Yes, so we're getting there. And that's exactly like the next step,
Right.
right? So we have the property poor district, or the language says the district with the lowest taxing capacity, I believe the language is. And essentially what we say is we look at all of the districts and the grand list per pupil across all of those districts. And whichever district has the lowest grand list per pupil, that's what we're benchmarking against. We say in this district, how much could we raise on this district's grand list per pupil at a certain tax rate? And this is where that 80% penalty comes in. Saying, okay, this lowest property value school district, we're not gonna assume they have 100% of that value. We're gonna assume they have 80% of that value to implement the penalty even at the lowest value district. And so that's where we calculate that excess spending tax rate. In this lowest taxing capacity district, a dollar rate at 80% of the grand list is gonna give X number of dollars per pupil. And using that rate, then that rate is applied to every district in the state. And we say, okay, say that district, regardless of the property value, that district votes a certain amount of spending per pupil. And we say, well, in the lowest taxing capacity district, this is the rate that would be necessary to raise those funds. So we're going to use that same rate in all of the other districts that vote that same level of spending. But to your point, those districts that have more property wealth, more is going to be raised than in the lowest taxing capacity district, because there's more property being taxed, more value being taxed. And so the sense is, not the sense, what's in the proposal is all of those additional, I'm using air quotes, additional dollars that are being raised than would be raised at that lowest value district are flowing into this reserve.
Okay.
So what we're saying is, everybody is getting the same rate for the same spending above per pupil. That spending above per pupil is going to be decided locally. But that rate is going to raise different amounts in different communities because of their grand list. So if it raises more than it would raise in the lowest value district, the more is going to stay in the ed fund in a reserve. And that district is going to be sent back the amount that they voted.
So just in much simpler and probably technically incorrect words, there's a dollar cap, and anything above that dollar amount gets sent back to the ed fund based on that lowest rate district, lowest property income.
So I think that,
I think you're getting the gist, but it's technically incorrect, and so it's really hard for Julia to answer you.
Okay, I think you're right.
and I would say, I guess, a few things. I won't say yes or no to your question. I will say we need to be careful with the term cap, Because cap within the proposal refers to a whole other policy choice of how much are districts allowed to raise above? Any number of dollars, or is it limited? And that's why I hesitate using the term cap. But essentially, I think the gist, I see vibes on your board, so I wouldn't normally say vibes in testimony, but I think the vibes
I heard.
are right in the sense that essentially what you're saying is, district, if you levy this tax rate, you get this many dollars per pupil from the education fund. You may be paying more into the education fund and the reserve than are being raised from that tax rate, but this tax rate gives you X number of dollars.
Perhaps I'm just missing something. Why go to the 0.8?
Yeah, that's what I don't get.
So I think, so the 0.8 that, you mean the 0.8 that's in the language, like,
Yes.
why is it in the language or?
Why require a higher district to spend more than just the 1-to-1 and have the excess go in, but actually have that penalty of the extra 20%?
So I would say, that's completely a policy decision.
So it's to just incur more pain. So if you're going to spend more, it's just to incur more pain.
I would say, yeah, the more that you benchmark that lowest district down, you know, if it's 0.8 or 0.7 or whatever, the more that you benchmark it down, of course, the higher the rate would need to be to raise a certain amount of funds, yes. And the other piece of the policy question is that lowest property value district, that district with a low in taxing capacity, the policy question is raised, should they be paying anything into the reserve themselves? Or should so right now, the 0.8 means that your lowest property value district is also paying into the reserve. Whereas if there was no 0.8 or 0.9, they would not be paying anything into the reserve because they would be raising all of the funds on their local grand list, sending it up to the ed fund, and then all of those funds would be sent back to the district. So that's a policy choice.
Representative Filter.
I had thought that part of this so-called penalty was to create an extra cushion that could be shunted off to a school construction fund.
Yeah, so and I'm intentionally trying to walk the fine line of discussing what's in the bill without saying, these are all policy choices, right? But what's right now in the bill is essentially those extra dollars that are being raised in school districts that are not going back to school districts are going into a reserve. And then the bill has, after a year or two, I don't recall, a waterfall from that reserve into a school construction special fund.
What does the reserve do in the
Interim.
interim?
In the interim, the reserve is, I believe, being held to account for mathematical errors or other calculation or unexpected circumstances, just with the mechanics of all of it. But to your point, that is a policy consideration if you're trying to, you know, if you want a higher size of that reserve, you want a larger amount waterfalling into the school construction fund or a larger amount held in that reserve, then you may want to consider that 0.8.
Mhm.
The other piece is that I think is worth noting is under this construct, there's no dollars that need to be budgeted ahead of time to ensure that districts spending over the cap or spending over the foundation are equalized, right? In the governor's state guarantee proposal, essentially it's providing that difference. So it's making districts whole. But in this proposal, it's there's no dollars that need to be set aside before the vote for districts to be able to raise above.
I don't get the set aside thing. Why would you think about setting aside money?
So in this proposal, you don't need to.
Yeah, but why? Why were you talking about?
I was talking about it because I think it's important when we're thinking about and perhaps I'm further confusing the conversation. The reason I'm raising it is when considering the policy levers and considering the reserve and considering the size of the reserve and the dollars going into the reserve and what's in there, where does it go? In this instance, because a tax rate is guaranteed in that district is guaranteed to fund all of the dollars that that district is spending over the foundation amount. You don't need to budget or reserve dollars for a forward-looking budget vote. Because the tax rate is going to raise the dollars that were voted, plus some.
So what, can I ask another question? So what I've been saying, and this is not related, the thing that does benefit to Act 6068 is you vote your budget and then we vote the yield bill. If we don't give you enough money, you vote out a yield bill, you go back to your some percentage on top of your prior year budget to spend. What I think, whatever the calculations. Is this that kind of protection so that with the foundation formula, you definitely get the money to run your school district?
So with, I'm not,
You have to vote like.
with the foundation formula, essentially it's saying you've got your base, you've got your weights, you've got your pupil count, and it's saying, for the foundation formula, here's your foundation amount. It's being appropriated, it's going out the door. There's other categorical aid also going to those school districts. And then we're talking about if a school district rate decides or needs to, whatever, or if a school district raises above that foundation amount, categorical aid, any other funds that they're getting, and they say that's not sufficient, we want more. We're talking about the mechanism for that school district to be able to raise those funds. Okay.
So I think-
I'm not saying what this.
I think one of the things that's, no matter how we take care of spending on top, the foundation formula is designed to guarantee that folks have money no matter what vote's taken, no matter what. That's one of the things that's lovely about it. I think one of the things that's a benefit of this particular way of spending on top is that folks can know in advance of budgeting and voting what the rate is that they would be budgeting for and voting on. And it would be much more straightforward. And so the concerns that have been voiced over the last few years about the complications in the system would be significantly simplified. It's certainly complicated to develop the legislation, especially right now in this moment to hear this all on a Friday afternoon. But I think the actual information that would go to voters would be significantly simpler than what we are experiencing right now. It's one of the benefits of doing it this particular way. Because it's just it's a rate for dollars raised. Yeah, go ahead, Julie.
And I think one other piece of this that is helpful to keep in mind, to the chair's point, is included also in the draft is in the December 1 letter saying, district by district, this is the grand list per ADM. This is the lowest value grand list per ADM. So in the December 1 letter, that preliminary excess spending rate, or whatever it's called, that excess spending rate is we're able to be calculated in December.
Just as a general thought, because I can see Charlie. I think that we have to have this because the foundation formula assumes that providing the same amount of money for kids of a certain need is sufficient, but our state was not designed with that in mind. And for districts that are already blowing past the excess spending penalty, there's no way they will be able to educate their kids because they don't have the scale. They're going to get subsidized for being small. There's going to be a transition period, so we have to have some flexibility. Instead of thinking this as, I think of this as ensuring that when some people rise, everyone has a chance of rising, which I think is
appreciate
a
that.
positive way to put a spin on it. And what we're trying to make sure is that we don't end up with an individual case where a district has so much property wealth that it can just blow the ceiling and other districts are just left behind again. So I think it does ensure that we're bringing everyone along. But the reality is there are some districts that are going to be hugely disadvantaged under this formula. And so you have to have this.
And again, remembering that we are going to do there will be significant policy changes before the foundation formula goes into effect, but certainly we're not going to be on the other side of transformation when the foundation formula goes into effect. I'm wondering if folks have more questions for Julia.
I do.
Yes.
So if you were comparing what the governor proposed, not in 5 districts with a state guarantee, to what this proposal is, and the state guarantee works differently, and that the property taxes that are assessed to fund the foundation formula and the state guarantee really are kind of blind. It goes into a pool. And so those districts that don't have the ability to raise additional funds are then assisted from the pool of money. Do I understand that correctly?
Yes.
Right? And the districts that want to spend more money, they are just raising the money that they need to spend.
Yes.
They're already paying for the pool for the other communities, but they don't really know it because it's built into the tax rate to fund them.
Yes, and so too are the districts that are accessing the pool.
They're blind to it as well.
Well, I would, I'm not going to use the word blind, but the way that the state guarantee works is the base rate needs to increase to fund the state guarantee because it's a grant. So the way that the governor's proposal works is everybody's base rate goes up to raise the state guarantee. And then the school districts that need the state guarantee then receive the state guarantee, which they have partially funded in addition to the other districts that are not receiving the state guarantee.
And there might be a penalty built in that. There might not be a penalty built in that. I don't think there's a proposed penalty in that structure.
Under the proposal that came from the administration, I don't recall any sort of penalty built in. It was also benchmarked, the administration's proposal was also benchmarked against the median school district wealth, which meant grand list value, which meant that median that's right in the middle, right? So the school districts that are on the lower end are going to be receiving the state guarantee if they decide to spend over. The school districts for the median tax rate, the school districts above would be able to levy a tax on their own local.
I think it's,
Yep.
I think that's really helpful. And I think it might be confusing that we're talking about 2 proposals simultaneously with no words in front of us. So what I'm going to suggest is that we go back to John, review the legislative language next week. Maybe Juliet and John can make some charts comparing the 2 proposals. And so we can see them sort of discreetly and the policy trade-offs in each because I appreciate the frame of policy trade-offs as we are doing our work.
Yeah, and that it comes from a positive, right? It's about making sure everybody has a fair chance.
Right.
And I think the foundation formula will work better the more the ed committee can address the structural issues.
Yep.
Because it will reduce the variation.
Great. John, hi. Hello. And remember, it's not you, it's us.
I'm returning humble, not beaten yet.
Don't worry, Julia confused us by the end too. Not you.
Well, it's interesting because one of the things that Julia said toward the end about the December 1 letter is exactly where my mind was at, and I think is a nice place to show language,
Great.
to talk about the informational advantages this offers. So let me.
And folks, we have 30 minutes left in our week.
So December 1 letter, and I'll tell you what page if you're interested. I'm looking at page 32. And something I want to draw out here is that the December 1 letter includes multiple kinds of information. So it includes particular recommendations. As you know it now, it sets out the yields and recommendations for rates. And then it also includes some information that's supplied along with those recommendations. So what we're looking at here is information that's proposed to be supplied with the recommendations. And so what you see here, subdivision 1, along with recommendations made under this section, Commissioner of Taxes shall include the base amount. As we've talked about, this is something that would be known because that's going to be a figure fixed in statute that is inflation adjusted. So they've set out that inflation adjusted base amount, which is what we use to determine your educational opportunity payment. It would include for each school district the estimated long-term membership. So that's your 2-year pupil count, average pupil count. Your weighted long-term membership, so your long-term membership, but reflecting the weighting factors, and the aggregate equalized education property tax grand list of municipal members. So you know basically wealth, population, and the like for the school district. Third, for each school district, and you could derive what you see in subdivisions 3 and 4 from what you have in 2, but for each school district, the estimated grand list of its municipal members per long-term membership. So that's telling you wealth per student is the easy way to think about that concept. And from that, you could rank the school districts to identify in 4, the estimated school district with the lowest taxing capacity. The reason I draw this out is that from all of these numbers, you can then derive the actual recommendations. So this is the recommendations that would arrive in that December 1 letter. Annually not later than December 1, the Commissioner of Taxes, after consulting with Secretary of Education, Administration, Joint Fiscal Office, shall calculate and recommend the statewide education property tax rate pursuant to subsection 5402. I should call out here, in the same way that under our current system, we account for non-property tax revenues to determine how much is left to fund, you would still need to account for those other sources of revenue. But basically what you're trying to determine here is what rate is sufficient to raise the educational opportunity payment for each school district. And that would just be a mathematical question of your base amount times your weighted long-term membership for each school district. So this letter would recommend that statewide education property tax rate, and it would also recommend the excess spending yield. And in this case, the yield would be as simple as you could just identify what is raised at a given rate in the school district with the lowest taxing capacity. So those could be set out in this letter, and from that information, school districts could then know what it's going to cost them, what rate they're going to require to raise the funds that they want to raise. So that's your December 1 letter. And with that, I can scroll back up to the definitions that I ended on last time, but I do want to be conscious of where people's brains are at this point. Okay. So let me that, and I will pause my screen share briefly till I get up there. Okay, so my hope is not to inundate you with extra information, but to now point to the language that supports all of the discussion that we just had. So we're talking about definitions in Title 32, excess spending. This is the amount that's voted. So that's what you see in subdivision 18. That's the spending page. We're on page 22, bottom of page 22. So subdivision 18, excess spending is the spending that a school district approves in excess of its educational opportunity payment. That's your base amount as multiplied by your weighted long-term membership. So it's a spending that's approved in excess of that payment for the fiscal year and for which no existing revenue sources are available, provided that no school district shall approve spending in excess of. In this case, we're proposing 10% of the school district's educational opportunity payment. So that's the cap that has been built into this, into draft 1.1 here. Excess spending penalty, you're subject.
Folks, again, we have a choice to make about if there's a cap or not. We have a choice to make, is that the right cap?
And so just, was that 10% just for supposal at this point, or what was that based?
think I made an arbitrary, I picked an arbitrary.
Yes.
But it's possible I didn't. I really don't remember. Do you remember me making?
I
an
remember, if you're okay with me carefully, we were just on a call and I said, what do you want to do? And she said, let's have a cap of 10%. And that was it.
Arbitrary.
Zooming down.
You know, so once we have the bill, we can beg our illustrious staff and JFO model it, and you'll have a sense of how realistic that is.
Yeah, absolutely.
Districts, right now, we have no idea.
Yeah.
So that's excess spending, that's your voted spending, the local spending. Excess spending penalty, what we're talking about is that extra amount that's raised when you are taxing through the excess spending rate. So the amount of revenue raised through imposition of the excess spending tax that is in excess of that voted amount. That's exactly what this is, and that's what stays in that reserve in the ed fund.
John, can you tell me what it means when it says, for which no existing revenue source is available?
Yes, so if you had like if there are donations available locally, or if there are other alternative sources for funding that amount that you're voting locally, we want to ensure that the school district isn't imposing a tax that raises the amount that they've already got money on hand for, basically. So it's just ensuring you're only raising as much as is required to be raised through the taxes.
Okay, thanks.
For the excess spending yield, this is the shorthand way to describe this is pretend that you're the school district with the lowest taxing capacity. So what we do is we ask how much revenue per long-term membership could be raised in that school district at a given rate. And in this case, we've talked about what's applied here is 80 cents on the dollar per 100. That's building in the penalty. But what this is saying is how much could you raise at a given tax rate? That's all that the yield is in this particular case. And it's just asking for that school district with the lowest taxing capacity district, what you could raise. The reason this figure matters is it allows you to easily calculate what rate you would be required to raise those funds in that school district, because you can just divide your spending by what could be raised at a given rate, and it gives you an output. It gives you a rate at the end of that. That is what would be required to raise that were you the school district with the lowest taxing capacity.
So would that be included in the commissioner's letter?
Yes, the yield would be exactly, because they would know you would have the grand list. You would have the aggregated grand list for each school district. So you could rank per long-term membership and identify that school district with the lowest taxing capacity. And then you would just ask, if I applied a given rate, this rate, in this case, we're talking about 80 cents on the dollar per 100. If I applied that rate, how much money would come out at the end? How much revenue is produced by applying that rate? And that would be included in the letter. And it really is just as simple as asking at a rate, what revenue is raised. Subdivision 21, per pupil excess spending, intuitive concept. This is the per pupil amount of excess spending resulting from dividing that excess spending by long-term membership. And I would just remind the committee, when we've talked about the educational opportunity payment and the base, we've talked about weighted long-term membership, because we're saying that the foundation amount that's being provided is meant to account for the meaningful distinctions among students. But here, for the excess spending piece, we're talking about long-term membership, not weighted long-term membership. So I just want to flag that for the committee.
What's the difference between long-term membership and long-term average daily membership?
So they are the same thing. The long-term average daily membership is not a defined term. I think it is the way that people have most commonly talked about this. And it's why I've been confused when people say that, because the defined term is long-term membership or weighted long-term membership. But when you're thinking of long-term average daily membership, that's what this is.
Thank you.
Yep. And then subdivision 22, we've talked about this one a bunch. I think the committee is on the same page on this one. School district with the lowest taxing capacity. That's your school district anticipated to have the lowest aggregate equalized education property tax grand list per long-term membership.
Yes. Okay, so here's,
Mhm.
are you talking about, let's say, the state is carved up into however many.
Mhm.
When you talk about the school district lowest taxing capacity, meaning you look at the grand list of everything,
Exactly.
within the border of the school district. would that necessarily be within the border of one town? Not necessarily.
No, and that's why, that's a good point. It's why you see the word aggregate here. Because if you're just talking about a district, you don't need to, if it's a small district that is contiguous with a town, you don't have to aggregate anything, right? Just the grand list for that town is going to be what the grand list is for the school district. Because we're contemplating here large districts that encompass all kinds of municipalities, you need to have an aggregate. So that's what this is the aggregate equalized education property tax grand list, which just means the grand list for all of the towns in there.
All right, so will one, if we were to do the 5 districts of Jefferson, one of those 5 is a district?
But one of,
Yes.
yes,
Yeah. So the capacity to raise is then by those 5, field of those 5?
the capacity is for the district as a whole. That's the,
Something.
And we're talking about lowest taxing capacity inclusive of non-homestead.
so this is the rate that is proposed here is a flat rate that doesn't distinguish among kinds of property. So there is no investigation of, oh, is your taxing capacity different because we're distinguishing between classes of property. So that is and if you think about the 9 classifications proposed, you could get into quite complicated determinations of what actual capacity is. But the excess spending rate is a rate that applies equally across classes.
Uniformly.
Yes, exactly.
Thank you. Yes, Representative
I'll
Hooker.
ask the chair, because I've not been in this committee very long. Has this committee ever done a report of the effect of Act 60 on development patterns of the state?
I have not been on this committee as long as Representative Maslin, Representative Canfield.
Oh.
Or Representative
It's a good
Brandon.
question, but I don't think we've come near asking that. Which we should have, I suppose.
I imagine it would be hard to hold all of the other factors
Right.
constant, given everything that's happened here since the 90s.
But I suspect it has been done someplace. I mean, I suspect we could look at baseline trends.
Maybe.
But it's irrelevant.
Onwards.
Okay. We're jumping down to page 24. So section 14, this is the actual imposition of the statewide education tax. And just to orient, recall that there are 2 taxes proposed. There's the statewide, which is raising what's sufficient for the educational opportunity payment. And then second, there is the excess spending tax, which is particular to what school districts vote. So here in subsection A, we're talking about that statewide rate, so raised statewide, unlike the excess spending, which is raised locally. Statewide education tax imposed on all non-homestead and homestead property. And you can see the current law, the way that we deal with this. The proposal here is a rate sufficient to raise that educational opportunity payment for each school district for the fiscal year after accounting for forecasted available revenues. So that's, you could have those non-property tax sources flowing into the ed fund. And it is the intention of the General Assembly that the rate would be adopted for each fiscal year. So that would be adopted to account for the cost of the EOP after accounting for forecasted available revenues. And then Kirby has been talking to you about the classification that's pulled into the proposal here. So what's proposed is setting one statewide education tax rate, but it's adjusted for all of the different kinds of classification that you have set up here. And the simplified version that I have for this is a table. Obviously, we don't have the actual figures themselves, but it asks if the tax classification of a property is homestead, if it's residential A, whatever it might be, then it tells you to multiply that base statewide education tax rate by a factor. So that's what you see here is just a list of the classifications and what factor by which you would.
Sorry, I did not catch that we were transitioning slightly. Is everyone okay transitioning slightly?
Say that again, I'm sorry, didn't hear.
I didn't catch that we were transitioning into sort of a new bucket of our policy work. Is everyone ready to transition to the new bucket of policy work?
No,
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, let's go back to our other bucket.
So
Or scroll just a little bit.
this is the way that the excess spending tax is imposed. I can
Okay.
not show you the chart if that's helpful for folks.
Yeah.
And you can just pretend you didn't see it.
That sounds great. Let's do that. Thank you. Yes,
Go on. So each of our 5 districts that we've got
which might be some other number of districts. But each of the 5 has to come up with a figure for each of the homestead, non-homestead.
No.
No,
And this goes to a point that Jake had raised and that the chair had responded to was, I think the vision here is that you'd have a set of factors in statute. And so for, let's say for non-homestead public use, it'd be 2. So you would multiply by that factor each year. This wouldn't be something that each district has to set. It would be in the green books what the factor you multiply the base rate by is.
until we change the law, it stays the same.
Yes.
Right.
The proportions here, so like the homestead rate would be changed every year.
It could be. It could be.
But the proportions for the non-homestead versus that would vary.
That's fine.
It would stay the same, yeah, the proportions would stay the same.
But not something that the local municipalities would need to cover. In subsection B, this is conforming changes that follow from the updates to the statewide education tax. So because you are now just multiplying base by weighted long-term membership and not using a yield to determine that statewide rate, right? You're just using the mathematical exercise for this. You can drop out some of the current concepts we have in existing law. So the statewide adjustment in particular is what I'm thinking of. You don't have to account for the effect of the statewide adjustment on raising this rate because the yield is no longer used for the statewide education property tax. So that's what you're seeing here. I will skip over some of these conforming pieces just because they flow through from other stuff, but please feel free to reach out if you have questions as to why language has been deleted. What you're seeing here is all conforming changes. Subdivision 3, though, at the bottom of page 26. In existing law, you see this struck language at the bottom of the page. In existing law, we have a provision for an interim rate if folks haven't voted a budget in their district. In this concept, the idea is that you don't need to have an interim rate because you're going to have that statewide education rate determined based on multiplying the base figure, the base amount by the weighted long-term membership. So there's no need anymore to have an interim rate.
But if you have the excess spending approved in year 1, and then it doesn't get approved in year 2.
Yep.
There's no automatic default to what it was in the previous year.
Exactly. So this is a policy choice in this place. And I think that the thinking behind this is that the voted amount doesn't have the same meaning that it does in the current world, where it determines the entirety of your education spending. You might in one year have excess spending under this proposal and in another not. So it's hard to say if what you spent last year is an indication of what you would spend this year. That's the way that I think about it. But that's right. It is a policy choice whether you would like to have a fallback. For conforming changes on page 27, there is something meaningful here I'd like to call out in sub 2. So under existing law, it's the Secretary of Education that determines each municipality's net education tax payment. And this does propose to switch that to being the Commissioner of Taxes. So that's the language that you're seeing here and throughout this subdivision.
Why would we switch that? Why is it at the secretary level anyway? I mean, why is it an education? That's
That's the question I asked, and that's why I moved to Commissioner of Taxes. Affecting workload. My understanding is, and we should have tax testify to this, but tax is an enormous amount of work to lead to the Secretary.
Yeah, right,
Doing
yeah.
that, and so I don't, we should have everyone in to tell us about it.
There's cons
Too.
Yeah, we should have both.
I imagine they're both gonna come in regardless of whether we want them to or not. On this very narrow topic, I imagine they have many other reasons to join us next week. That's what I mean.
Also relates to some of the things in the ed bill. I mean, I think we want to be a little careful about that.
At the bottom here, this language may seem familiar to you from when we walked through the homestead exemption pieces about a month ago. This is a retention for late property tax credit claims because the PTC is being stripped out in this proposal and replaced with the homestead exemption. We don't need this language anymore. Similarly, on 28, subsection E, conforming changes for the the fact that you're moving to or the consideration is that you could move to a different district model. Under existing law, we have to account for the fact that you could be a municipality paying different rates based on the different school districts that you're in. And so you have to create weighted averages if you're in one of these municipalities. Under this proposal, you wouldn't have that complexity. So we don't need to provide this. So simplification in this particular instance. What you're seeing on page 29, this new subsection F is the imposition of the excess spending tax. So we were just talking above about the statewide tax for raising the educational opportunity payment. And now we're talking about just imposing that excess spending tax. And you're going to see what I was speaking about with the excess spending yield before, hypothetically. So excess spending tax imposed on all homestead and non-homestead property in each municipality that approves spending. The commissioner shall determine that excess spending tax rate for each school district by dividing the school district's per pupil excess spending as certified by the Secretary of Education by the yield. So that's what we've been talking about when I've been saying you can determine that rate by looking to what you want to raise and comparing it against what could be raised at a given rate within the school district with the lowest taxing capacity. I will call out that for myself, I need to make an edit here because this does tell you the calculation, but it doesn't technically produce a rate. So I just need to spell out that it is a rate. So that's for me to remember, but just to call out, I am noting that. And then technical provisions for actually billing out. So legislative body to bill each property taxpayer at the rate determined under this subsection, divided by the municipality's CLA and multiplied by the current grand list value. The provisions that you see here are just following those that we use for applying and billing taxes for the statewide as well. So nothing really novel here. It's just creating these provisions for the excess spending tax itself. And I've also flagged for myself to think about how to include the statewide adjustment here because you are using a yield in this case. And I'll talk with Julie and others about if I need to factor that piece in. The bill would show the tax due and the calculation of the rate. Again, these aren't novel provisions. This is just using or describing in the same way that we do this for the statewide rate. And that's what you see in subdivision 2 as well. The bill may be on a single sheet of paper with the excess spending tax, that statewide tax, and any other taxes printed separately and side by side. And then same schedule for levying the taxes. So by December 1 of the year in which the tax is levied, and on June 1 of the following year, the treasurer of the municipality is to pay to the state treasurer for deposit in the ed fund. This is your flowing up.
That's all mostly current law.
Exactly. This is just duplicating the provisions that exist in current law for the statewide and using them for the excess spending tax rate. And this is the provision that accomplishes that flow of dollars up. Commissioner of Taxes to determine each muni's net excess spending tax payment. That's what we were just talking about with moving from the Secretary of Education to the Commissioner. Obviously, we don't have strike through language here because this is new statutory language.
I'd just be curious, it might be worth, I'd be curious to know if the revenues actually come to the state and go back. I think currently they don't actually flow that way and actually districts get the interest. Are you proposing to change that?
Yes.
Wow, so it'll come to the state and the state will get the interest?
I have so I've been trying to understand how much interest is in each place. And definitely if it came to the state, more interest would be raised because it would be more money sitting all together. But I think there's still, and I'm sure all of you have heard this, all over the state, a lot of folks still talk in pre-Act 60 language. And I think part of that is that the mechanism still functions in sort of a pre-Act 60 way in certain ways. And so I think having the actual flows of dollars match the intent might help sort of validate on the ground the philosophical structure of the bill. And maybe I've profoundly overthought the situation. But this is my theory about why some people talk in sort of that pre-Act 60 language.
Bill, I think we would want to check it didn't affect borrowing in advance of revenues, because it's not just interest, it's also borrowing costs.
It's interesting too, because it makes me think about even the use of a subdivision for like this, like why you would need to call out a net excess spending tax payment, because each district is fully raising the amount that it, right, like you're not going to have the case of a school district where they would receive more from the ed fund than they would raise locally to net. You wouldn't have to net in that case because everyone's raising the excess spending.
Which
They're
is,
full
I
of it.
mean, the other way to handle it would be to let every district hold on to.
So
I mean, there's pros and cons.
There are a lot of pros and cons.
And one of the things that matters here is because you are creating that reserve and there is a penalty that is above just the excess spending that you raise, some money is going up definitively, whatever your spending happens to be. On 31, we are back to the December 1 letter, so I don't have to belabor this again, but I'm happy to hit points here. I think that if you're looking at the draft, this is a nice place to ground yourself, like it's kind of straightforward mechanisms to understand relative to the complicated definitions above. So this is a nice place to return to see like what information is required to make particular determinations and what recommendations would be received from the Commissioner of Taxes. So that's past the actual creation of the excess spending tax rate and the imposition of the excess spending tax to all those to property across the state. The next sections are conforming revisions. We've actually gone through language that's quite similar to this before when we walked through the administration proposal. So I can not belabor these sections and just respond to questions if folks have them about this. I know we're also close to running out of time, so it may be helpful just given where we are ending up to orient where in the draft you can look for other pieces. So after we've talked about the excess spending tax rate, you have these conforming changes. This is something that if you're thinking about where to spend brain power, this is not one you have to spend as much brain power on. But then we do get to here on page 34, the statewide property tax credit repeal and the homestead exemption. I know you guys have been expending a lot of energy on this lately, so hopefully this will be fresh in your minds. We have walked through the basis for this language before, but what we have that is new here is the actual charts that Julia has presented, those new income brackets. You won't have seen that language before. So I will jump down to where you can see that, just so it's not frightening if you're looking at it for the first time on page. Sorry, I'm doing whiplash here, so let's. It'll be 66, which starts on the bottom of page 39. Second. Computation of the homestead property tax exemption, the municipal property tax credit, and the renter credit. You're going to see that the old PTC, the existing PTC, is struck in subsection A, and then substituted in its place is the new exemption. And so that's the, yep.
Can I ask a quick question? So then for municipal property tax, is there still going to be some kind of credit system?
That still exists. Yep, there's still.
So it's going to be in parallel to the exemption system that we're talking about.
So it works in the same way that it currently works in tandem with the education property tax credit, those are distinct mechanisms. So you're just repealing the PTC and replacing with an exemption and holding on to that old municipal function or existing. I keep saying old when I mean existing.
Talk about the circuit breaker.
Yes. So the language you see here on page 41, an eligible claimant who owned the homestead on April 1 of the claim year shall be entitled to a homestead property tax exemption in the claim year in an amount. And then you're going to subdivisions here, which spell out the categories that Julia's walked through and that Jake also was discussing today. So you have it's in ascending orders, I guess the way to think about this. Subdivision A is those at your lowest income for claimants whose household income is equal to or less than 25,000, and you receive this 95% exemption from house site. Just to remind folks, that's a homestead, but limited to the 2 acres that are surrounding it. So it's not the full extent if you exceed the 2-acre limit. And then you have your ascending categories. So above 25, but up to 47, you get an exemption of 90%. And I don't have to restate the figures if this is all fresh for you guys, but this is where you can find that concept in legislative language. Pause again. And just to show, here's the holding on to the municipal credit. So this is what you see on page 43, the eligible claimant who owned the homestead in April 1 and whose household income doesn't exceed 47,000 shall also be entitled to a credit amount against the claimant's municipal taxes. So it's holding on to the familiar pieces here.
Will you remind me where the municipal tax exemption comes from?
Where it's paid from?
Oh,
General fund.
thank you.
It's 29. So
This may be a natural place to pause, but I'm happy to go on as long as you guys.
I love that we found a natural place to pause. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for stopping the visit very much. And thank you for a wild and wildly appreciate you all. See you on Monday. We're going to be meeting from 1 to 4 via Zoom. I know some people are not available for all of that. We're going to be walking through the bill with Beth St. James that the Education Committee is voting out right around now. So if you aren't able to make the whole thing, please read it or watch it on YouTube or whatever works. And then on Tuesday, we'll start with the sort of the plan that we all laid out together this morning. Please be in touch over the weekend with any outstanding questions that you don't think you've raised, so I can make sure that I'm scheduling the testimony we need to schedule.